The Hag of the Wail, written and read by Christopher Halton. For many months I was haunted in my dreams by a creature so vile, so ugly, that one could scarcely describe it as human. It appeared in my sleep as an aged, foul-smelling hag with rotten teeth, leathery skin, a sharp, pinched nose, and a pronounced jaw that gave it the appearance of a demon cast from the gates of hell. It possessed a mass of thick, dirty grey hair, and parts of its wiry body were devoid of flesh, exposing bone. Its clothes, or rather the rags in which it was dressed, were dank and equally rotten. It resembled a reanimated corpse transformed into something far more horrific. Why I had occasion to dream of a thing that was the very curse of nightmares, I know not. Yet it was there, and it returned again and again, appearing first in otherwise pleasant dreams, intruding upon memories of happier times. I survived these encounters only by waking suddenly, panting and drenched in sweat. I consulted many doctors and, as might be expected, received many opinions, though none offered a satisfactory explanation, and so the nightly terror continued, each visitation growing more threatening, more menacing. As the owner of a busy textile company based in Whitechapel, London, I soon found that my business was suffering. By day I was too exhausted to manage it properly, and by night too frightened to sleep. My partner in these affairs, a kindly friend and gentleman named John Wingate, eventually remarked upon my declining performance. I was compelled to admit the cause of this disastrous state. He insisted that the business could be run effectively for a few months without my direct involvement, and agreed to assume my responsibilities, alongside his own, while I sought the rest and recuperation that were clearly necessary. Reluctantly, I agreed. After securing a temporary lease on Place Glanros, a late Georgian country house of 10 bedrooms, hewn from native stone and situated in the Elan Valley of Wales, I dispatched 2 maids and a butler from my household to prepare it in advance of my arrival. I myself arrived in May of 1934, conveyed in my Lanchester 4-light saloon, and driven by my chauffeur Richards. By then my staff were already in residence, and had ensured that all was in readiness. The house came with a resident cook and a general handyman, Mr. and Mrs. Griffiths, who lived in a tied cottage on the 20-acre estate. Everything appeared picture-perfect in this secluded oasis, folded gently into the valley. That night, weary after many hours of travel, I hesitatingly retired to my bedchamber. I was surprised to discover that I enjoyed a full night's uninterrupted sleep, and awoke feeling refreshed, possessed of an energy that had so wastefully been drained from me. Mrs. Griffiths, a doughty Welsh lady in her late 40s, had prepared a sumptuous breakfast, and outside the air was clean and invigorating, a far cry from life among the denizens of London. How fortunate I was! Jerome Mason, a man revitalized, longing once more to re-engage with a life I had thought stolen from me by the hag of my dreams. The Elan Valley, as I soon discovered, is a land of contrasts, where man has left his mark in the great reservoirs that dominate the landscape. Heather, rough grass and peat stretch for miles, broken only by narrow roads that meander for hours at a time. Situated in the heart of ancient Wales, the valley rises into the Cambrian mountains before mellowing into open, mist-laden moorland, populated chiefly by sheep and the ruins of stone farmsteads long abandoned to the elements. There is a sepulchral quality to this place, a sense that forgotten rites and long-lost acts of sacrifice still linger beneath the soil. Lichen-shrouded monoliths scar the land, their worn surfaces seeming to echo the voices of those who first set them there, masters of their own creation, and perhaps of something far older still. I took to riding again, having not saddled up since my youth, and with my renewed vigour explored the varied remote landscape in search of daily adventure, returning each evening to the house for dinner. Each morning I mapped my intended route and ensured I carried sufficient provisions in case unforeseen difficulties arose during my travels. On a memorable day in June, a sky that had been clear and blue darkened with alarming speed. Storm clouds seemingly born of nothing swept down from the Cambrian mountains as I rode across the moors. The change was sudden and violent. A biting wind rose, heavy with rain, driving me to seek shelter upon a flat, barren plain. "Serendipity!" I exclaimed aloud, spying through the mist a stone cottage, its thatched roof pressed low against bare walls. The ground there was hard and unyielding. I dismounted and led my horse towards it, but the creature, ordinarily docile and strong of nerve, balked at once. It reared and neighed wildly, refusing all command, before wrenching itself free and galloping off in the direction of home. I was left standing alone, clutching only a small knapsack containing a few provisions and a battery lamp. I cursed the animal bitterly as it vanished into the rain. By then I was no longer merely wet, but dangerously cold. Smoke curled from the cottage chimney, and I knew there could be only one hope of shelter. I crossed to the door and rapped hard upon the decaying wood. At once it swung inward as though my knock had merely completed a motion already begun. Inside was a cave-like hovel, almost entirely devoid of the adornments of civilized life, save for a number of candles already burning. Pieces of cloth stitched together with thin leather cord formed crude covering, once trousers, dresses, jackets, now cut apart and reassembled. There were no windows, only wooden shutters sealing rough openings in each of the four walls. Everything within appeared to be handcrafted. A broad slab of stone resting upon two smaller ones served as a low table, while other slabs propped against rocks along the walls formed crude benches. At the centre of the room a peat fire burned, its smoke drawn upward through a jagged hole in the thatch. The hovel reeked of something I could not properly identify, a dense mixture of foul odours that pressed upon the senses and made my stomach turn. From outside came not the sound of human voices, but the grunts and growls of creatures. I saw them enter the room. Fearing, not unreasonably, for my safety, I searched desperately for concealment and forced myself into a dark cavity some 5 feet deep, crudely cut into the native stone. It was shaped like a pit. The floor beneath my hands was strewn with sticks and smooth hollow objects I could not at first identify. I remained utterly still as 3 bipedal figures gathered before the fire. One sniffed the air loudly, like a pig at feed, and that sound terrified me, for it suggested I had been scented. Yet its attention was diverted by a 4th figure dragging inside a pale dead body already partially butchered. They hacked at the flesh and seated themselves upon the stone benches, feeding with the urgency and focus of wolves at a kill. I could see only their legs. All wore rags, 3 in trousers, the 4th in a shredded dress. The stench of meat was overwhelming. As they fed, they snarled at one another if a portion was taken too freely, but none uttered a single word that could be described as human, only grunts and animal sounds. After what felt like a very long while, they finished their meal. One of them gathered the remains and cast the bones casually into the hole in which I was hiding. It was then that I saw a partially eaten human face still attached to a skull. Others followed, bones from every part of the human anatomy, picked clean as they passed from the tallowy brightness of the room into darkness. I fought desperately to maintain control. Had I been armed, I might have emerged firing blindly, but I was not. The horse had carried off my pistol, And so I lay there longer still, scarcely daring to breathe, until the creatures rose and went out into the night. The rain and wind had abated, and I heard them wander off into the moors, perhaps in anticipation of their next prey. Once I was certain they were gone, I lit my battery lamp. Among the many bones I counted dozens of human skulls, some still bearing scraps of decaying flesh. I stumbled outside into the fresh air and vomited violently, releasing at last the revulsion that had overwhelmed me. Using an ordnance survey map and a compass, I made my way back toward the house, some 15 miles distant across mixed and treacherous terrain. I was exhausted beyond measure when, at last, my fortune turned. In the distance ahead I saw small lights swaying and heard men talking and dogs barking as they drew near. As they came almost upon me, I heard my butler cry, "Here he is, thank God." I remember no more. I awoke the next day in my own bed. Sitting beside me was my maid, who, upon realizing I was conscious, gently squeezed my shoulder and said, "Wait here, sir. The doctor wishes to speak with you." She left for a few moments before returning with a bespectacled gentleman dressed in a tweed jacket, who introduced himself as Dr. Dafydd Morgan from the nearby village of Lamberlin. With a calm, reassuring manner softened by a gentle Welsh accent, he seated himself in the maid's chair and began to prepare the pipe he held in his hand. "How the devil are you, old boy?" he said lightly. "You were fortunate indeed to be found safely upon the moors last night." He struck a match, lit the pipe, and continued. "Many folk lost there to the elements are never seen again." As he puffed thoughtfully on the shag tobacco, I replied, "And I know why, Doctor. There are creatures there, things that devour human flesh." He looked understandably taken aback by this declaration, and responded with measured concern. There, you endured quite an ordeal with the weather and all, and you are fortunate to be alive. But I can assure you, there are no creatures or monsters in the Cambrian mountains that prey upon men. Tell me, did you suffer a fall or lose consciousness before you were found? Such experiences can have a most unsettling effect upon the mind." His response irritated me profoundly, and I snapped, "I am not a damn fool, Doctor. I know what I saw and what I experienced, and you yourself confirmed that people have disappeared there, never to be seen again." He appeared genuinely startled and for a moment at a loss for words. I am sorry, old chap," he stammered at last. "I never meant to give offence." Realizing the harshness of my response, I apologized to him, but insisted that he listen to my account before forming any judgment. And so, over the course of the next 20 minutes, I related my tale in full, and with the aid of my map, indicated the precise location of the creature's lair. He sat in silence throughout, studying the chart with methodical care. Almost as an afterthought, I mentioned the hag of my dreams, though here I was less forthcoming, certain that he would take this as evidence of delirium. "Well," he began, then paused. "In Welsh mythology there is a creature such as you describe. It is known as the Grachi Ribbon. I believe it translates as the Hag of the Wail, or the Shrieking Hag." He shifted in his chair. "It is, of course, a story told to frighten errant children, but as legend it stretches back beyond recorded memory. Yet when you speak of 3 creatures in that hovel, one cannot help but wonder whether there is some connection between your dreams and what you encountered upon the moors." We spoke for a few minutes longer before he insisted that I remain in bed for at least a day. He added that he would return once I had sufficiently recovered, at which time we might arrange a visit to the moors to determine whether the hovel could be found. I readily agreed to this, and shortly thereafter he took his leave. As a precaution, I retrieved my pistol from the items brought in from my saddlebag and placed it beneath my pillow, where its presence offered a small measure of reassurance. Throughout the day, I was attentively cared for by my staff, with meals brought to my room and the daily newspaper delivered. I resolved to put the ordeal behind me and restore my life to some semblance of normality. However, as I was soon to discover, normality was not something I could so easily reclaim. That night I awoke to the sound of movement within the room. At first it resembled the furtive progress of something crawling upon its knees. Then a foul stench assailed my nostrils, rank and animal, and I felt my body seized with terror. Even so, I steadied myself enough to slip my hand beneath the bedsheets and grasp the pistol, while with the other I flicked on the bedside lamp. Leaning over me was the hag of my dreams. It sniffed at me audibly, its breath hot and putrid, and I saw saliva glisten at its mouth. I fired blindly from beneath the covers. The bullet grazed the creature, and it let out a piercing, ear-splitting shriek before scrambling through the open window and vanishing into the night. The report of the pistol and the unearthly cry roused the household at once. My butler and maids rushed into the room, alarm written plainly upon their faces. I ordered them to summon the police immediately, explaining that an intruder had entered my chamber. As they hurried away, I rose from the bed, drew on my dressing gown and slippers, and waited. Shortly afterwards, a black saloon drew up on the drive, from which 3 police constables and a sergeant alighted. They conducted a thorough torchlight search of the grounds, but by then there was no trace of the intruder. At the window of my bedchamber, however, and beside the bed where the creature had stood, they discovered traces of a reddish-brown substance that emitted a putrefying stench. It bore the unmistakable appearance of blood spatter. The sergeant examined it closely, pushed back the peak of his helmet, and stood staring at the marks in silence. "I've seen blood, sir, plenty of it, over the years," he said at last, "but nothing like this. Would you object if I requested the police surgeon to attend in the morning?" "Of course," I replied. "In that case," he continued, "may I ask that you sleep tonight in a spare bedroom? I'd like to preserve this room as a crime scene." I raised no objection and instructed the staff to keep clear of my bedchamber and ensure the door remained locked. Once these arrangements had been made, I retired elsewhere in the house and attempted, without much success, to obtain some measure of rest until morning came. Later that day, I received a visit from Dr. L.C. Mathers, a general practitioner based in Aberystwyth, who also held a degree in biology and lectured in that subject at the university. I mention these particulars for clarity, as he was more than qualified to examine the room and collect samples from the scene. Mathers was a serious yet congenial fellow, and he conducted his work with meticulous method. He examined the chamber in minute detail before using sterile cotton swabs to collect samples of the liquid, which had begun to congeal, though the stench, a reek akin to advanced decay, was no less putrid than when it was first discovered. In manner and appearance, Mathers exemplified the old-school physician of the late Victorian era, a stout man in his 60s with a large bushy beard and matching eyebrows, and a deep booming voice that inspired confidence. "Very odd," he remarked at last. "This substance resembles hemoglobin in its consistency, yet the colour and odour are entirely wrong. If pressed, I should say it was taken from a dead body, though in this instance that cannot possibly be the case." Using tweezers, he placed the samples into a small glass phial, sealed it with a cork, and affixed a handwritten label. "I'll have this examined today by the chaps at the university laboratory," he continued, "and shall telephone you with the results, which I will also forward to the police." After accepting a cup of tea from the maid, he took his leave. Nothing of note occurred over the next 2 days. Then, quite unexpectedly, I received a telephone call from Dr. Mathers. The substance, he informed me, was undeniably human blood and was actively putrefying. Yet its cellular structure was unlike anything known to medical science, and most disturbingly appeared to remain alive. He admitted freely that this defied any plausible explanation, and that should the owner of the blood be located, it would constitute a medical impossibility, a paradox wholly unknown to nature. I thanked the doctor for his professionalism and assured him that should I encounter the creature again, he would be the first to be informed. This seemed to please him greatly, and he ended the call shortly thereafter. Later I spoke with the police regarding Dr. Mather's findings, and under the guise of casual interest, inquired whether there had been many cases of persons reported missing in the Elan Valley who were never recovered. The officer confirmed that this was indeed so, though he emphasized that most were tourists or walkers who had likely lost their way and succumbed to the elements. The Cambrian mountains, he said, were unforgiving terrain, and it remained entirely possible for a man to disappear there without a trace. As a final aside, he admitted that he could not say how many such cases there had been over the years, but recalled at least 5 instances that fit that description. I therefore resolved at the earliest opportunity to determine whether I could locate the creature's lair, and if necessary destroy them, for whatever else they might be, they were not human beings by any accepted measure. Having few contacts in the district, I telephoned Dr. David Morgan at his surgery. After I shared with him the substance of Dr. Mather's report, he agreed to accompany me. His familiarity with local myth and folklore made him, I believed, the most suitable choice, and more importantly, he knew the land. In light of my previous encounter, we agreed it would be unwise to ride and instead set out on foot. We armed ourselves with pistols and knives, and I packed the very pistol in my knapsack, should we need to signal for help. We set off at 10 o'clock the following morning. The day was warm, bright, and deceptively calm, though I knew from experience how swiftly the weather could turn. After several hours, I recognized the approach to the hovel, which soon emerged from the moorland ahead. We removed our sidearms and advanced cautiously toward the door. From within came no sound. We pushed the door open and found 3 of the ragged creatures asleep upon the stone benches, their bodies folded in grotesque imitation of rest. As our lamps shone upon them, they stirred and raised themselves upon their arms, fixing us with feral, unblinking stares. They hissed softly, baring discoloured teeth. In their features I recognized unmistakably the likeness of the hag that had haunted my dreams. They had once been human, of that I was certain, but how they had been reduced to this state lay beyond comprehension. I set my knapsack gently upon the ground, moving with deliberate slowness. Any sudden motion, I sensed, would provoke violence. At that moment, Dr. Morgan stepped forward. He raised one hand, not in threat, but as one might calm an animal. The effect was immediate and unsettling. The creatures recoiled, shrinking back against the stone, then lowered themselves to the floor, lying prone and motionless. I turned to him in disbelief. "How is this possible?" I whispered. He did not answer. Instead, he moved among them with an ease that chilled me, resting a hand briefly upon one misshapen shoulder, then another. The creatures remained utterly submissive. When he finally turned back toward me, his expression was unreadable. It was then that something in him seemed to shift. His posture altered, his features tightening into something ancient and wrong. The air felt suddenly heavy, oppressive, as though the moor itself pressed inward. A terrible certainty seized me. Before I could speak, he advanced, his mouth drawn back in a snarl I knew too well. Saliva glistened upon his lips. The resemblance to the thing of my nightmares was unmistakable. I acted without thought. Tearing open my knapsack, I seized the very pistol and fired. The flare struck amid the thatch and erupted in blinding light and heat. I shielded my eyes and fled for the door as screams, human or otherwise, I could not tell, rose behind me. Flames spread with terrifying speed. I dragged a heavy stone across the entrance as the cries grew desperate, pleading, then incoherent. At last there was only the roar of fire. I did not look back. I returned to Place Glanross, shaken and exhausted, yet filled with a profound sense of relief. The police later concluded that the remains found within the burned hovel were those of 4 individuals who had been living in extreme isolation. The matter was quietly closed. Preferring life in the valley to my former existence in London, I sold my share of the business to my partner and purchased the house and estate, resolving to live out my days there in peace. Some months later, 2 physicians conducted their daily rounds in the secure ward of Whitchurch Mental Hospital in Cardiff. They paused briefly outside one of the rooms. "Room 242, said Dr. Mathers quietly. "Jerome Mason, the London gentleman who burned down a country dwelling in the Elan Valley." "Yes," replied his colleague. "A tragic case." Dr. Mathers glanced through the small inspection window. Inside, this patient sat calmly, gazing out at nothing in particular, his expression oddly content. "He believes he destroyed 4 inhuman creatures by fire," Mathers said, "that they haunted his dreams and fed upon the lost. He insists he still resides in the house he burned." His companion sighed. "And Dr. Morgan?" A faint, regretful smile crossed Mather's face. "In Mason's account, Morgan was the monster itself." They stood in silence for a moment longer. "It is unlikely he will ever recover," Mathers said at last. "But he is at peace." The 2 men moved on, leaving behind a quietly smiling patient seated alone with his certainty. The end.